Drummers today, and especially with less experience, they don't mix themselves. The great drummers all mix themselves. Again, anybody who's been on the cover of Modern Drummer, you know, more than once or twice, mixes themselves. Again, certainly there's things we can do from a recording point of view to change the perspective or enhance certain things they do. Like, oh wow, it'd be nice to bring that little ghost note up unnaturally, or something like that. But all of the great drummers mix themselves. Put up a pair of overheads, kick drum mic for some reinforcement, and you should be really rocking. And everything else is just kind of reinforcement to alter the drums in a kind of unnatural way, which serves a lot of pop and rock music. Recording great drum sounds is easy. We could teach monkeys to do it. It's sort of like, put mic here, get banana. And, we could train monkeys to do it. The problem is recording not great drum sounds can be tough. And then you end up having to pull up all your favorite Jedi tricks to try and, get a usable drum sound. But for me, yeah, I'm really looking at trying to capture the sound of the drums. And my own particular technique, for me, my overheads, or whether they're out front or behind, but I should have one stereo pair on the drums that captures most of the drum sound I need that's probably pretty light in the kick drum. If you can't pull up, 3 microphones and go, man, those drums are rocking, you really need to take some steps back. Because, any of the drummers that you mentioned earlier, Bissonette, Bozio, Mastellato, put up 3 mics on those guys and you've got a great drum sound. And it's one of those things, again, no disrespect to the, great Andy Johns and Eddie Kramer, but Bonham, I mean, come on. And, one of the things I've heard about, the genius of Bonham too was, they would do a take and he'd come in and listen and be like, oh man, yeah, that ride cymbal's not cutting through and that tom's a little overbearing. Okay, let me go do it again. It wasn't a matter of you've got to go move these microphones. It was like, oh, let me go do that again. I'm always looking to see how few drum mics I can use. And that'll be however many it needs to be, and I might put up other drums for, safety or reinforcement or the desire to do something creative a little later down the road. I like drums that kind of sound like drums, which isn't what every record is going for, especially things like extreme metal and things like that, where they have no interest in the drums sounding like drums. But I tend to go for things that sound like drums. And so it doesn't matter whether I'm doing a jazz record, singer-songwriter, hard rock record, metal, country. It's all, again, pull up 3 mics. We should be, have something that's pretty darn usable. And the truth is, if you prepare the drums right, I could take any amateur recordist and teach them to get pretty killer drum sounds in about 20 minutes. If people tune their drums, inappropriately for the song or the vision of the record, it's taken me over 2 decades of doing this stuff to try and, solve that problem. When we talk about microphones, which are just so vitally important, your microphones are so much more important than your plug-in collection. But the great thing is that there's just some fantastic microphones that aren't ridiculously expensive. That said, I mean, there's an old Neumann U47 in great condition. You record on that, and there actually is something about those that is kind of wonderful in its own character. Doesn't mean it's better than something you could buy today, but there's a particular character about that. But when it comes to drums in particular, my favorite drum mics are not expensive or esoteric. If you, said, hey, here's $100,000 for a set of drum overheads, we'd go spend $1,000 on a pair of Shure KSM 32s, and we'd have a lot of money left over for a really good party. And again, that's the thing. They're about $500 new, and I prefer them over any mic I've ever used on drum overheads, almost regardless of genre. Forgive me for a second, because I'm about to sound like a Shure ad, which I'm not, but they got the drum thing dialed in. But it's sort of a pair of Shure KSM 32s, a Shure Beta 52 on the kick drum, and a Shure SM57 on the snare drum. that probably puts us at 1,300 bucks or so, probably well under 1,000 on the used market. That's probably 800 bucks a mic. And if you can't get killer drum sounds with that, it's not the fault of your mics. And for me, the majority of records I do, those 4 microphones make up the core of the work I do, regardless of whether we've got a huge budget or it's just some fun local indie band, scraping together pennies. Use the best preamps you can. And as with all of this gear, it's fun to play around with the expensive esoteric stuff, but you don't have to. I just really encourage people to stay out of the gutter. Just the really absolute cheapo junk stuff, because spend a little bit more money and get into something decent. Even a little bit more money gets you into like a little Mackie mixer, which are okay. They're not great by any stretch, but they're okay. Much below that, you're in just junk that's going to hurt your audio. And I always have people say, well, I can't afford this stuff. And they're having that conversation while they've got a name brand drink from the bar in one hand and telling me about their new plasma TV. And it's like, well, it's not my fault you don't care about sound. I mean, it's not my problem or my fault. But the good thing about this is there's so much stuff that's not esoterically priced these days. When putting gear together, whether we're talking about, outboard or even just the plugins you buy, and especially true with microphones, you are much, much, much better off having a small collection of really good quality tools than a lot of different options. You're much better off if your entire studio has, 4 good microphones. You're way better off than having 50 crummy ones. You're way better off having one really kick-ass plug-in compressor than, 20 that are kind of mediocre. And it can be applied to any sort of instrument as well. I mean, you're much better off with one great snare drum than 10 ones that don't sound very good. And a lot of people make the mistake of trying to reach for options and it all looks so daunting. Well, save up, get a few really good tools. That's the thing, to really focus on quality rather than quantity. And that makes everything else so easy. And really spend your money at the front end. When you're buying gear, focus on getting good microphones and good mic preamps. And if money's tight, get some good mics, good mic preamps, and just use the stock plugins that came free with your computer software. Don't get cheap microphones and upgrade to an expensive plug-in pack, because if you nail it at the front end, everything else becomes easy. I always tell people I would, almost 100 times out of 100, I would rather have a record that was recorded with good front end, good technique, we got the arrangements right, and mix it on, an M box with some Pro Tools like LE beginner system, than have something that was done inappropriately and have a $500,000 Neve to mix it on. 10 times out of 10, 100 out of 100. Because if you nail the front end, all these discussions about, oh, is that a real 1176 or a plug-in? Are you mixing on a console or, on an iPad? All that stuff becomes so much less relevant if you do great stuff at the beginning. If you do great performances, get your gear sounding right, use simple techniques that don't screw stuff up, the rest is easy and it's much, much less relevant. I'm not anti-EQ while I track, but I rarely EQ drums while I track. For the simple reason that I've got a few hundred albums under my belt and I still screw it up first time around. I always say, like, I'll be mixing a record and dial in something for the overheads or the snare drum, like, oh, that's the best snare sound ever. And then I kind of get the rest of the record going and go, oh, wow, I blew that. That's the wrong frequency, or I pushed up a frequency too much, and go, oh, let me back that off. And part of that is, I've got the luxury of, some pretty good tools available to me at mix time. So EQ, it's rare that I use it while I track. The times where I will do it sometimes is if there's a particular piece of gear and I want the tonality or the vibe of that piece of gear on the record, if I'm tracking in one room and mixing in another that doesn't have it. So, if I'm mixing, out at Stagg Street in Van Nuys, which is the gorgeous API console with great API EQs, I might nudge things around a little bit to bring some of that API vibe to the record, which I've got tons of great stuff here, but I don't have that kind of flavor here. So sometimes I'll commit it. But my my kind of golden rule with compression and EQ and things like that is, when in doubt, the answer is just don't. Because in the world of 24-bit digital, the downsides to doing it after are so minimal. If you're tracking to tape at a slower tape speed, there are definitely some reasons you might want to consider doing that stuff more. But it's so rare, especially for people with less experience tracking to tape these days, that when in doubt, just don't.